Here comes the Beantrospective on Circle of the Moon. This game was released in 2001 and published by Konami. Hope you guys enjoy. So Castlevania Circle of the Moon. This one's pretty unique in terms of the Castlevania games. This is actually the only game that Koji Igarashi, the man who's accredited with the majority of the series developments, was completely uninvolved in. This was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance. It came out in 2001, and in 2000 at a Tokyo Game Show, there was a playable demo that was showcased, and that demo actually featured the ability to choose characters between Nathan and Hugh, the two main characters in the story, who we'll get to later. When the game released, obviously Nathan Graves ended up being the only character, and this is the only game that Nathan Graves appears in, as well as is referenced in. This is no longer canon. It was at the time of coming out, but that was retconned after the fact. Mainly due to the fact that Koji Igarashi did not exactly like the direction and some of the lore choices that they made in the game. So when it comes to who actually made the game, the producers were Shigeru Umezaki. The main artist was Kazuko Fujihara, and the composers Sotaro Tojima, Hishiro Mitsuka, and Taru Kudo. Those are not the main composers from the previous or future games. They worked specifically on this game. The whole team basically only really had influence on this specific Castlevania game. So, considering this was a direct follow-up to Symphony of the Night, and Symphony of the Night was such a completely beloved game at the time of release, a lot of people expected it to be a lower quality product considering a different team was producing it, but it actually was received really well when it was released. I would say, after having recently played through it, that it still holds up reasonably well today. When it comes to gameplay in this game, it's in a very interesting spot, honestly. The DSS, or dual system setup, that is a mechanic that only appears in this game, and it's honestly a pretty strong mechanic. It just never reappeared because these developers were never brought back onto another Castlevania game. On top of that, it may be a side effect of the game being the first Game Boy game to use the RPG elements that were incorporated in Symphony of the Night. It may also just have something to do with the way that this team wanted to develop this game, but I would argue that Nathan moves more similar to a Richter or Simon Belmont, a classic Castlevania character, than one of the new Metroidvania characters who are very free-flowing and loose with their movement. Not to say that the movement feels bad, but Nathan is definitely a lot heavier than the majority of the characters that we'll be working with moving forward. It might be something that's hard to see or hard to convey without actually playing the game, but he is very committal on his jump arc. So the dual system setup, basically how that works, you'll have 10 action cards and 10 attribute cards. The action cards have gods and goddesses from Roman mythology. The attribute cards will have creatures. You'll pick one action card and one attribute card, and any combination has a unique effect. So there's going to be 100 unique effects in total. Some of them are pretty basic, like stat ups, and some of them are pretty fantastical, like creature summons. So this game takes place in a unique castle. It is not Dracula's castle. It is presumably Camilla's castle. in the very beginning of the game, the opening scene, we see Nathan Graves, Hugh Baldwin, and their master enter a room where Camilla has just recently revived Dracula. And Nathan and Hugh fall through the floor, leaving their master. The whip that Nathan wields is not the vampire killer from all the other games. It's actually called the Hunter Whip. A pretty interesting choice. It functions pretty much the same as the vampire killer, and a major plot point of the game is that their master decided to give Nathan the Hunter Whip over Hugh, so it's obviously a relic like the vampire killer is. During their journey, Nathan learns that Camilla's plan is to use his master, Morris Baldwin's soul, during the full moon to return Dracula to full power. Nathan also, during his quest, has to defeat his friend Hugh, who's been overtaken by jealousy, presumably influenced by Dracula. But it's clear that that seed was there even before his influence. The game was reported to sell about 1 million copies the year of release, and scores were in the 8s to 10s normally, 8s and 9s. It was very well received at the time of release. Koji Igarashi decided to retcon the events of the game. Even though it sort of made sense, it was met with some backlash because there are a lot of fans of this game. Me personally, this was the first one I ever played when I was young. I had a Game Boy, and I just thought that the text on the cartridge looked cool, so I grabbed it, and it became one of my favorite games, and then I searched out the rest of the series because of that. As for Igarashi's opinion on the game, when developing the follow-up, Harmony of Dissonance, he actually talked frequently about the flaws that he saw in the game. Some of which are understandable. He talked about how dark the game appeared to be on the Game Boy, which I do remember it was decently hard to see because of the backlight and the darker colors. But to be fair, Symphony of the Night is a rather dark game as well, save a few parts of the map. He also criticized the DSS system for not really fitting with the theme of the Castlevania universe, but he did admit that he thought it was a strong system in its own right. According to Igarashi, the title was always intended by the original development team to be a standalone title. The events of this game take place in 1830, and it's hard to tell what Dracula we're dealing with exactly. It seems to be the Dracula from the rest of the story because he makes it clear that he will return in a set period of time. The castle crumbles in a similar way, and his abilities, which he uses in his first and final form, seem in line with what we've seen from Dracula in the rest of the series. However, as stated before, this is not the same castle, so it may not even rebuild at the time of Dracula's revival. This game has a lot of the classic relics from the Castlevania series. You've got the tackle, the dash boots, the double jump, the rock wing. Overall, I think on my own arbitrary scale, I'd give the game an 8 out of 10. A really strong, enjoyable game, even 20 whole years after release. I do prefer the majority of the other games in the series to this one, but you have to appreciate what a separate team was able to accomplish, and not only how close they came, but the innovations that they actually brought to the table that weren't used moving forward. But there are some really good ideas here.